Good afternoon. I'm Noelle Ellerson-Ing with AASA, the School Superintendents Association. Our webinar, Meeting the Moment, Leveraging Federal Relief to Grow Community Schools, will start momentarily. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:01 p.m. I'd like to start our webinar off. Thank you, first of all, for taking time out of your busy day to join us today for a very critical and timely conversation. I'm Noelle Ellerson-Ing, Associate Executive Director for Advocacy and Governance with AASA, the School Superintendents Association. This webinar, Meeting the Moment, Leveraging Federal Relief to Grow Community Schools, is offered in coordination with our friends at the Coalition for Community Schools and the National Center for Community Schools. We are very excited to be offering this information. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few moments to share some housekeeping related items. Please take a few minutes to walk through these with me. The first housekeeping item is to ensure that you are connected to audio. The audio is available from your computer. Please ensure that your sound is on at this time. The second housekeeping note is about muting. To ensure that each person has a quality experience, all attendees will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar. The third housekeeping item is about participating in the Q&A segment. We've allotted time for questions during the Q&A segment. All questions will be fielded using the chat feature. Please take the time now to locate the chat box on your screen. If you don't see the chat box, click on the chat tab and it should appear. Although you may have questions for a particular presenter, please be mindful to send your questions to all panelists or all panelists and attendees in the pull-down menu. Type your message and then press send. We strongly encourage you to post your questions as they arise, and we will answer them live in the chat or at the end during the Q&A segment. And the fourth and final housekeeping note is that we are recording today's session to share with all registrants and other members. Our session is also being shared live on Facebook, so we have a broader audience, and we're excited to be talking with you all today. So as it relates to the content that brought you all here today, Community Schools, a strategy to organize the resources and voices of schools and communities around student success, are needed now more than ever. And new federal relief and recovery dollars present an important opportunity to transform our nation's schools into dynamic child-centered platforms that generate solutions and advance equity. I'm very humbled and happy to be introducing our three panelists today, although the superintendent participating in the panel is busy running her school system, so she'll be joining us just before her comments. But before I turn it over to Abe, who's gonna give us an overview to kick things off, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists today. Dr. Brenda Caselias is the superintendent of Boston Public Schools, and she'll be joining us momentarily to share direct from the ground feedback, perspective, and insight, not only on Boston's ongoing work and relationship with community schools, but their plans moving forward and the opportunity that has been afforded to them in light of some of these federal funds. Marty Blank is the founding director for the Coalition of Community Schools. I've had the privilege of working with him my entire career at AASA. He's a longtime friend of public education students and AASA, and we're happy to have him here today, in particular sharing insights and perspectives from a new and timely paper that he's co-authored with some friends and fellow academics. And rounding out our hat trick of excellent presenters, we're happy to be joined by Abe Fernandez, who's the director of the National Center for Community Schools. Abe, thank you for reaching out to AASA and partnering with us on this content. I'd like to turn it over to you for the actual webinar today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Noelle. Let me get my screen share going here. Okay, hopefully you all can see that screen. So Again, thank you, Noel, for that introduction and for getting us started. Really excited to have this conversation today. Many thanks to you and to AASA for our partnership and for hosting this webinar. So we have actually quite a few folks that we're going to be hearing from today, including Marty and Dr. Caselias. We also want to make sure we have time for your questions. So why don't we jump right in? As Noel mentioned, my name is Abe Fernandez. I have the great privilege of directing the National Center for Community Schools at Children's Aid in New York City. The National Center is a practice-based technical assistance provider. So we at Children's Aid have partnered with the New York City Department of Education for almost 30 years now on the direct implementation of community schools in New York City. And the National Center has leveraged that experience and that of our clients, some of who I think are joining us today, which is great, to support the startup, the scale up, and the sustainability of community schools across the country and beyond, via training and coaching and consultation for almost as long, about 28 years now. Our firm belief at the National Center is that every school should be a community school, which is why we're really excited about this opportunity today, but also the moment that we're in, that we're talking about as the focus of the webinar. So let's jump in. So my job to get things started here today is to help define exactly what a community school is, which I will do by sharing a couple of definitions, followed by a really quick look at some research that confirms the efficacy of the approach. There's a lot that we can say here, so we're just going to give you enough to get you started for folks who are new to this idea, but of course, many, many resources we can share. So the first definition I want to share actually comes to us, it's actually a quote from a former superintendent of St. Paul Public Schools many years ago. And we overheard her say this, that community schools are a strategy for organizing the resources of the school and community around student success. So I want to point out that she chose to describe it as a strategy and not a program, which is a really important point, because many of us have been conditioned to think in terms of programs and services and interventions. But unlike a program, strategies like community schools typically do not have a predetermined beginning, middle, and end, nor do they have one dedicated funding stream. Instead, they change over time according to how the conditions, the needs, and opportunities change. They often integrate existing and new partners and integrate existing and new funding streams. And that changes over time as well. And they're usually multifaceted and adaptive, requiring multiple stakeholders to inform and drive the solutions they generate. But don't get me wrong, there are definitely programs and services and interventions involved in this work. We definitely need high quality programs and services. The difference is that community schools create the connective tissue between those programs, if you will, as well as the decision-making processes that make them most relevant and best utilized. So this is our first definition. The second one I'll share is one that is much more of a sort of a textbook definition, which comes to us from the Coalition for Community Schools, which you're going to hear about, I'm sure, from Marty a little bit more. And Children's Aid is proud to be a founding and active member of the coalition, and as is ASA. And we're also proud to have played a role along many others in developing what this definition looks like. Instead of reading it to you, I think I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that I really appreciate about what's here. First, this definition references community schools being both a place and a set of partnerships, right? So there are both physical and non-physical relationship-based aspects to this strategy. This is especially important to consider when you think about how the pandemic, when many folks weren't able to physically access school buildings, community schools continue to find ways to leverage relationships and partnerships to keep the strategy going strong. The second aspect of this definition I really like is the results orientation. So the theory here is that community schools are not only able to influence student learning, but they can also strengthen families and can even impact our students' neighborhoods. right? This is a really powerful idea that recognizes not only the home and neighborhood factors at play in student success, but also positions the school as a place where change can happen and ripple outward far beyond the school's walls. So the last definition I'll share is more of a kind of a graphical, infographic sort of representation of the strategy. And I should have said that I started my career as a math teacher many years ago, and I learned pretty early on that triangles have three sides. I'm going to talk about the children's aid developmental triangle, the three sides that sort of make up this work. But before I get to the three sides, I want to start with what's at the center of this triangle. Community schools are built on being child-centered. And one of the most important lessons that we've learned is that we make our best decisions when kids are at the center of the conversation. This is a really important part of how we approach the work. Second, we also know that kids are parts of families. And so community schools build authentic relationships with families to better support them and their children. And they invite families to engage in the school's decision-making processes and structures. And to round out the central part of the graphic, students and families, and schools for that matter, are also parts of neighborhoods. So schools must reach out beyond their four walls to connect with their surrounding communities, to literally and figuratively understand where their students are coming from. Really important to keep this at the center of our thinking about what a community school is. Okay, so on to the three sides of the triangle. The first part of the triangle is the core instructional program. And we start with this side intentionally to emphasize that high quality instruction is a key part of the strategy. Offerings such as out of school time programming, mental health services, and workforce development as a few examples. These are all obviously really important, but what we've learned is that without effective, culturally competent teaching and curricula, delivered by a well-supported instructional team, we will never get all the results that we want for students. So it's a really important part of this model. The second side of the triangle here on the right side, we have expanded learning opportunities. And that word expanded is doing a lot of work here, right? So here it means expanded time. So we're talking about programs that can take place after school, during the summer, on weekends, even before school, and during the evening. It also refers to expanded engagement. So we're talking about providing students with varied activities and environments to broaden and deepen learning and develop all of who they are, whether it's through sports or expression, through leadership programs, et cetera. And then also expanded staffing. So in addition to the certified teachers that we talked about on the first side of the triangle, oftentimes community schools are able to engage other folks that students can learn from. Community members, teaching artists, near peers, college students, parents and families, and so on. It really is a way to bring all of the intelligence of a community into the school. And then finally, at the base of the triangle are what we call comprehensive support services. And you might think of these as supports that remove barriers to learning. And this can take many different forms. It could be individual or group therapy or counseling. It could be advocating for families who are experiencing homelessness in your school, even providing direct material assistance like weekend food backpacks or coats to make sure that kids can safely make it to and from school during the winter months. So a pretty wide range of opportunities to ensure that young people are present and able to fully engage in school. And so there you have the three sides of the triangle spelled out. Except that we're not quite done with this graphic yet, right? This is still not exactly a full representation of a community school. I have been in, and I'm sure many of you on the webinar have also been in schools that have tons of partnerships in place and a plethora of programs going on all along all three sides of the triangle, but they're still missing a really critical piece. I often describe these schools as doing random acts of programming, right? There's tons of activity going on, but it's not always clear who's doing what, nor whether we're doing the right things, nor if any of it is making any real difference. It's kind of random. And so we're not advocating for that. Instead, a community school embraces the last part here, which is what's happening at the vertices of this triangle, right? It's the ways in which these different sides of the triangle are connected to each other. And so I'll give you a few quick examples. So if we look at the core instructional program side, experience tells us that teachers are often the first people in a school to notice that a student might be in need of support. So what does that teacher do with that information? Is it up to them to, in addition to being a teacher, to also take on the role of social worker, counselor, bus driver, food pantry, etc.? Or is there a process in place to refer students to a supportive service? Is there a feedback mechanism in place so that the teacher is looped in and knows how to work with that student going forward? To what extent is that student's family engaged throughout the process and the next steps? All of that requires real systems to be developed, improved, and maintained. If we look at the expanded learning opportunity side, is the after-school program provider a ship passing through the night, so to speak, blindly delivering a preconceived set of activities? Or is there real alignment between what's happening during the school day and what happens after school? If the teaching staff, for example, are concerned that the fourth grade is struggling with English language arts, then it would make sense for the after-school program that serves that population to find ways to incorporate opportunities to build literacy skills into the afternoon. I don't mean repeating the English class. I mean folding literacy into their sports and arts and other youth development activities. It can be done. We should also think about the ways in which kids get into these expanded learning opportunities. Is it purely first come, first served? Or should we think about ensuring that particular students who would benefit most are the ones that are encouraged to apply first? And then on the comprehensive services front, all too often we come across school social workers, for example, or other clinicians who have a tremendous amount of expertise around child and youth development or how to create healing-centered spaces, for example, that are not being fully utilized. These folks could ostensibly train all the adults in a building, from teachers to partners, on how to create a universally supportive school climate. Additionally, do these social workers know enough about the school's offerings so that they include, for example, a leadership-focused summer camp as part of a particular student's treatment plan? If not, we're missing out on some opportunities. So the big idea here is that a community school is much more than a bunch of programs thrown into a school, or merely a more efficient service delivery mechanism. Instead, it's a strategic matrix of opportunities and services that are leveraged and aligned and guided by the perspectives of multiple stakeholders. The last point I'll make about this definition is about capacity. The fact is that this strategy does require additional capacity, right? The level of coordination that I'm describing here doesn't usually happen by itself automatically. Principals can do a lot, we know that, but they cannot do it all. And they really shouldn't have to. They already have lots on their plates with managing just the first side of the triangle, let alone all the other stuff too. So this is where the role of a community school coordinator or manager or director, they go by many different titles around the country. This is where this role comes in. A central part of their job description is to refine or create the types of systems that I'm talking about here, that I mentioned earlier. Much of their work lives at the vertices of the triangle, being that connective tissue that keeps kids at the center and avoids the randomness in how we sometimes serve our young people and families. So I know it's a little bit of an involved graphic, but I hope it's helpful in illustrating how the definitional concepts kind of come together and relate to one another. So I will just end with a couple of quick thoughts here that I want to share with you. One is, so just some research around this strategy. The Learning Policy Institute and the National Education Policy Center examined 143 evaluations of community schools back in 2017. And if you're not familiar with this meta-analysis, I recommend checking it out. I'll post it in the chat when I'm done here. And I'll just highlight a couple of things. First, they observed, the authors observed that community schools across the country have some similar features, these 4 pillars you see on the slide. And that these 4 pillars essentially enables the features of really good schools. So we're finding that community schools are actually just really, really good schools. And we want more good schools in this country. Second, the community school strategy meets all 4 levels of evidence under ESSA and are considered a viable approach to promoting educational equity, a really important takeaway from their study. And finally, the last point I'll highlight here is that they also found that the quality of implementation matters, right? That it is the key to producing positive outcomes. The better the implementation, the more comprehensive and integrated the work is, the more likely the community school is to yield positive results for students and families. The second study I'll just highlight comes more recent and more local to me, at least. Back in 2020, the RAND Corporation studied the New York City Community Schools Initiative, and after just 3 years, found that students in New York City community schools had these really positive outcomes: missed fewer days of school, fewer suspensions, and more likely to graduate on time. So lots to build on there after just 3 years of implementation. Obviously, there's been a lot of systemic work in New York and places like New York to get to this level of implementation. But we think that this really is a sign of how we should be approaching the strategy at scale. So with that, I'll end there, and I will pass the baton over to Marty Blank to share a few remarks about the moment that we're in. And I think many folks probably are very familiar with Marty, but I'll just say quickly that Marty is the founding director of the Coalition for Community Schools, which formed well over 20 years ago and is housed at the Institute for Educational Leadership, which Marty also led as president until his retirement in 2017. I think that's right. Marty is a giant in the community schools movement and also a friend and a mentor, and I'm really pleased he was able to make time to join us today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Marty.
Thanks, Abe. It's really a treat to be here. The one thing that I really appreciate neither Noel or Abe saying is I am now retired. I left in 2017, and of course there's a new director for the coalition, whom some of you may know, Jose Munoz, who's doing a terrific job. And as I scanned the participants, I noticed that Tawhida Jackson has joined this conversation. So welcome, Tawhida. It's lovely to have you here. I also want to thank AASA in particular, because they've been so supportive of our work over the years. Not only Noel, but Sharon Adams-Taylor and Brian Joffe and others have really helped us to advocate and to promote our ideas. And their recent report on how schools have to change really emphasizes the core of what makes a community school, and that is partnership and the kind of relationships that Abe was just alluding to. So, context here is important. We are at what some people might call an inflection point in the work of the community schools movement. When we started back in '97, people said, what's that? What's going on? Well, this week, the state of California appropriated more than $3 billion for community schools over the next 7 years. Now, obviously, California is not Arkansas or Wyoming or Florida or anyone else. But the point is that there is a lot of attention to this idea going on around the country. People are beginning to get what Joy Trifus told us 25 years ago. Schools alone do not have all the expertise or capacity to educate all of our children. And as Ira Harkavy would add, an isolation of schools from community will lead to failure. Schools must partner to build political capacity, to build political support, and to create the conditions for learning that kids really need. I want to add that, in addition to what's happening in California and other communities, the Secretary of Education Cardona testified recently and included specific references to the community schools aspect of President Biden's budget, which includes this extraordinary increase to $443 million. That is a sea change in how community schools are seen. The chair of the House Appropriations Committee is a community schools advocate, as is Sherrod Brown, who with the assistance of the coalition has offered a new bill to expand community schools and rethink how we talk about them at the federal level. But the moment is now, and the need is really, it's extraordinarily deep and significant. For years we've talked about all these issues and challenges that kids face. But everything that we knew before February and March of 2020 has been exponentially increased. Kids and their families have suffered through this terrible trauma of COVID. Teachers and youth workers and health and human service providers have also had a tough go. And yet in many community schools, we have seen how much of a difference the partnerships and the relationships can make. People finding kids so they get online, reaching out to families so they get the assistance they need, whether it's food or mental health support or any other kind of service. So the reality has been unpeeled of the challenges that our young people face, and we can't let people go back to think that there is more that they can just overlook all of these issues. We spent 20 years with No Child Left Behind, overlooking enormously significant aspects of children's learning and development. We cannot do that any longer. A couple more points, because I see that Superintendent Caselias has joined us, and I know her time is tight. But I want to add just couple more things. First, the community school can't ignore the issues of racial equity that have been, again, unpeeled with the murder of George Floyd and all of the attention that these issues have given us. Our Black and brown, LGBTQ and other children need more help, need more support. The only way we get to deal with that is if we bring everyone together, bring their expertise and bring their resources. And finally, this election showed us how critical schools are as bastions of democracy. The core of our electoral system has been challenged. There are continuing conflict about it. But schools were first critical to democracy and helping young people to be citizens. That cannot be left aside. And it's part of the reason why I would add to the 4 pillars that Abe correctly pointed out, that kids have to start, our curriculum in our schools has to be more meaningful, has to be more engaging. Young people have to work on community problems. They have to understand the history of their own community, how race has influenced it, how access to food and housing and other challenges all need to be understood by young people. They see them every day. When our schools ignore them, they pretend as though there are 2 different worlds out there, when in fact young people are facing all of that every day. I would just encourage you, as you think about these resources, I know lots of you are saying, oh, so much money, what are we going to do? Keep in mind these couple of things. You want to, if you're going to organize a community school, you always want to do something immediately that's going to have an impact on kids and families to increase the credibility of the enterprise, whether it's to reduce absenteeism or with the summer coming to figure out how partners in schools can work together on summer learning and expanded learning kinds of opportunities that Abe talked about. At the same time, plan with your partners for the future. Think about allocating slices of this money for community school coordinators. Once in place, every principal I have ever asked says, I can't live without my community school director or my community school coordinator. And many of you know that that's the case. I do know that this is not forever money, right? But we have seen people use money from United Ways and shift it to public school money and city government money. So once in place, the power of the idea is able to sustain itself. And so I urge all of you, those of you who are already doing community schools, this is the moment to expand to more places in your community. The resources are there. The evidence is there that this will work. Not just one more program, but a strategy that will help support young people and their families and their communities. So I'm going to stop there, Abe, and I can pick up a few more ideas in the Q&A once you and Dr. Caselias have had a chance to speak. I remember meeting her in Minneapolis when she was the chief state school officer, and we were talking about community schools. I can't remember, Dr. Caselias, whether we were in Minneapolis or in or St. Paul, but I know you understand this set of ideas, and I'm delighted to see you participating today. So thank you very much. Abe?
Great. Thank you, Marty. And yes, we definitely want to keep the conversation going. So if there are, I see a couple of folks have posted questions here, so please feel free to do that. And we'll have some time after our interview of Dr. Caselias to answer some of those questions and have a discussion about them. But at this time, let me just take a moment to thank Dr. Caselias for joining us, and I'll just briefly introduce her. There's lots we could say about her experience in schools and across this country. So I'll just give a little taste of it. So with more than 3 decades as an educator, Dr. Brenda Caselias has devoted her career to ensuring that all children succeed and thrive with an unrelenting commitment to ensuring every child receives an equitable, exceptional, and joyful education. Her leadership is student-centered, supportive of educators, and grounded in collaboration and effective community partnerships. Since starting as superintendent of the Boston Public Schools in July 2019, Dr. Caselias has collaborated with hundreds of students, educators, parents, and community members to develop the district's strategic framework to deliver a high-quality education for every BPS student. Before her work in Boston, as you heard from Marty, she was Minnesota's Commissioner of Education, where her work led to comprehensive education reforms that resulted in historic new state funding for schools, the enactment of all-day kindergarten, state-funded preschool for 25,000 children, and the highest high school graduation rates on record for all student groups. Prior to serving as commissioner, she served as superintendent of East Metro Integration District, as an associate superintendent in the Minneapolis Public School District, and academic superintendent of middle schools in Memphis, Tennessee, among other roles. I have the privilege of working with Dr. Caselias currently and her team on launching the Boston Hubs Initiative, which we will get into very shortly. But again, Dr. Caselias, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is a very busy time of year during an unprecedented year, so we will get right to it. So let me just ask the first question, and feel free to kind of give us a little bit more of your background if you wish. So would love to hear a little bit more about Boston and just to get everyone on the same page about Boston Public Schools.
Well, thank you, Abe, and thank you, Martin. I do remember that. I'm very blessed to have worked in a state where they saw the value of full service community schools and actually funded at the state level. And so was able to work with my team at the Minnesota Department of Education to really stand up some of the support systems for school districts across the state of Minnesota that were implementing the community school model. So I took that with me to Boston, which is one of the oldest public school districts within the nation. As you know, the home of the first public school. And we have about 125 schools, 53,000 students. And, about 75 to 80% of our students are high need. And of course, this past year of the pandemic was quite a challenge for so many of our students, not only in Boston, but across the nation. And it just really revealed for us the inequity, the deep inequity that exists within our urban public school systems, and so much work still yet to do. We have a population of students, about 22%, that are special needs. It's much higher than the national average, which is something I have to get after now that we can put the pandemic behind us. And then also about over 50% of our students speak a home language other than English as their first language. So quite a diverse community. And we are also a city that is a gateway city for our immigrant community, and we welcome that and thrive in it. And so we try to find ways to make resources available to many of our students who are not able or aren't able to access those because of their immigrant status. And so trying to find ways to extend those resources to families and create the bridges that they need to be successful within the community. And then in turn, then their children are successful.
That's great. Thanks for that context and background. One thing that I've learned in the past, really I've known for a while, because we've always known Boston was a part of the community schools family. And there have been community schools in Boston for a very long while. They're called hub schools in Boston, but it hasn't really gotten to scale. And so we'd love to hear if you could say a little bit about, if you could tell us more about the hub schools initiative that is recently gotten some new life, and how you're planning to leverage federal dollars to expand that work.
Yeah, so we have a number of schools that have hub schools within them. It is a priority of our teachers union, and they had interviewed me and asked me about that. And I was able to bring forward some of the work that we had done in Minnesota and some value to that piece, and then prioritize the work as part of our overall strategic vision of giving kids what they need. And part of that is also, circulating and ensuring that we circulate the whole entire family, and the community is leveraged in that effort. And so we can build on some of the successes of some of our other schools that have had the community schools within Boston, and learn from them as we approach our new kind of commitment to ensure that we have coordinated services for families and children within school, and then also externally in terms of partnerships. What we find in Boston, and it's probably very similar across the nation, is that there's great inequity from school to school, even within a district, on who has resources, who has services, and oftentimes families just don't know about those services and don't have a trusted adult and one that speaks their language and honors their culture within the community. And so we want to really take our anti-racist work to that, take our culturally proficient lens to that, make sure that we are cognizant of language barriers that exist, and ensure that our staff is fully trained and understanding in those anti-racist practices that are important. We purchased additional social workers this year to support our student support teams and our multi-tiered systems of support within our schools, to be able to have tier 1 supports as well as tier 2 supports within our schools for mental health support services and coordinated services. They'll work with a partner. We're partnering with the YMCA, and they're going to help us with driving this for coherence across our schools. So we'll be piloting in about 14 schools this anti-racist agenda to coordinate and blend and leverage community resources within our school to ensure that our parents have family liaisons and social workers within our schools, as well as our hub school coordinator, to get them the support systems that they need in order really to recover strong, but really for the long haul. I hear folks talking about ESSER to put up some of these, stand up some of the community schools across the nation. But I'll tell you, you just work it out. It's the right work to do for children and for families. And I think you just got to find it in your operating budget and create efficiencies elsewhere in order to prioritize this work. And that's what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. I mean, going from 2 schools to 14 schools is a huge endeavor, and it does speak to the amount of commitment and leadership there is in Boston to move this work forward. And I'm sure the opportunity to have federal dollars is really adding some momentum to that. So really exciting to see that happening.
We're also, just another piece too, is we're trying to do it also regionally. So we've had a group of schools that have gotten together and kind of done it organically, called our Grow Hall Alliance. And they have done incredible work of food shelving, support systems for families, working with our partner called Katie's Closet, doing some of those external pieces, but they're also doing the internal work that they have to do too, to provide for supports to our kiddos. But I think that, 14 out of 125 schools for me isn't fast enough. But my team has been, saying, look, let's get this right the first time. But I think every school needs a hub community school, because we really do need to make them the hub of the whole entire community. And I'd love to see our buildings be used from 7 a.m. until 9 p.m. every night, intergenerational supports for our families.
That's great. Yes, I could not agree more. Every school should be a hub school or community school. So, but we'll get there. It does take time to get to that place, but it's really wonderful to hear that the vision is to see this become universal. One of the questions that we've been hearing a lot from folks is, great to have this infusion of resources from the federal government, but it doesn't last forever. And so what are your thoughts about the sustaining this work beyond the next 2 or 3 years?
So most of our resources for this effort are coming from our commitment in our operational budget. So if you can find ways to do that, I encourage everybody to find ways to do that with either creating efficiencies or seeking new revenue or new partnerships in order to sustain it. As we think about our ESSER funding, we are already thinking about sustainability with the items that we choose for recovery and for reimagining our schools, a more equitable school district. And so we have like year 1 things, year 2, year 3. And then we have something, a column that says ongoing costs. So if we're going to invest in social workers, and you're going to invest in a hub school coordinator, or you're going to invest in a specific partnership, you have to already be thinking about how are you going to sustain that work long term, because nothing's worse than having people enter the community, become part of the family of the community, and then in 3 years see it go by the wayside, and then all those support systems for families they can no longer depend on. So it becomes an empty promise. So you have to build in place really strong support systems for sustainability on the front end.
That's right. It's not waiting until 3 years from now to start wondering what we do next, right? It starts. No. It already started, I'm sure. That's great. That's really good. That's really important advice. And speaking of advice, I know we only have a few more minutes with you. I was going to ask you for some general advice that you might offer your colleagues around the country, especially given the vantage point you've had to work in many different places. And I'm sure you've seen all kinds of districts and work with them. But I'm also just going to riff on one of the questions coming in the chat from Emily Collins, who I'm quickly paraphrasing here, that she's been working in a district where there's really only one community school, and is trying to understand how to help the district leadership to see the bigger picture of what can come, the good that can come from this strategy. So just along those lines, how would you talk to this work with your colleagues around the country who are either hesitant or not sure if this is a good investment? What advice do you give them?
Well, historically, Abe, it's been hard for schools to know how to partner with organizations. You have to have really clear agreements and outlines around memorandums of understanding for the expectations and conditions of the agreement, so that everybody's mission is understood. I think that's a really important piece of advice, is to outline these partnerships so that everybody, there's no clear no mix up of what the clear expectations are, who does what with the partnership. I think the other thing is to not underestimate capacity. It's hard to do this work. And so I think what we do is we try to do it quickly, and we shortchange it. So, they don't have project management or administrative support, or the principal's doing 6 or 7 other things, and so, securing an outside partner like the YMCA to help us manage it was really a key piece of making sure that we could do this with fidelity. And then I think the third thing, a piece of advice I would give folks, is to really ensure that you're, being very public and transparent about the results that you're getting for the effort. How many parents got housed? How many parents were able to secure jobs or had health access? What is your child obesity rates because you're getting better food, nutrition, and groceries home to families? Just trying to find those pieces of indicators that you can use to demonstrate the worth of the effort is really important to sustaining it long term.
And to your earlier point, that there's probably already a groundswell of desire around working in this way in your community. So the example you gave about the Grove Alliance, like there's probably already lots to build on. This doesn't have to start from zero. And what I've always appreciated about what I've heard from my work in Boston is that this is not just the school district working on this, it's the city of Boston and the people of Boston who are really all finding ways to bring what they offer into this work. So it's been really exciting from my perspective to see that take hold, and I'm really looking forward to what we get started this fall or continue this fall. So again,
we're so appreciative of your leadership and you helping us really cull, kind of our vision in a way that's implementable and with fidelity. And, I'm lucky to have such wonderful leadership within the district, leading these with Elich Tabor and Corey Harris, who were working on this in the early days to drive this. And then we've had really great foundation support too, with the Lewis Family Foundation and a few others who have just been really helpful in funding some of this early design work.
Could not agree more.
And I want to add for people to understand that, this isn't the first time that Boston has sort of stepped up to the plate and thought about and tried to put community schools in place. And I remember when George Dreyfus said to Tom Basant at a meeting at Harvard, one of Tom being a very well-known former superintendent, we can help you do this. We did a little bit of it. And then the system was not ready for a larger expansion, but people kept at this. So I want to just highlight for people who are on this call, the importance of kind of staying with what you believe is right for children and families and community, that we all have to come together to do this work. And now with Brenda's leadership in Boston, we're seeing and with Abe's help, we're seeing the revitalization of community schools at a moment when the need is as great as it has ever been. So thank you for this wonderful work, Brenda. If I may be personal.
Yeah, it's not just me. I mean, it's really my team driving this, and our BTU partners, our teachers have been fantastic leading this work. And so, I feel very blessed to have such incredible partners within the community and within my own team, and within the union, really supporting this work going forward. I think we're on the cusp of doing something great in Boston that's going to support not only children, but their families as well. And I think that's the best way you move forward with getting the achievable results that we all expect.
Wonderful. Well, I know you have to run, Dr. Caselias, but again, thank you for making time for us. And I think there are a lot of folks that have lots of questions here that we're going to try to follow up with them, but we're all looking forward to what we learned from Boston, and we hope to check in with you again soon, of course.
Thank you so much, Abe and Martin.
Right.
Appreciate you. Take care now.
And I'll hand it back to Noelle.
Thank you. It was excellent to hear from Dr. Caselias. And I mean, the framing of this webinar, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised, we helped plan it, but it was purposefully laid out to have Abe lay the groundwork for what community schools are, how they've evolved, how they've anchored in communities and really bolstered addressing achievement gaps, providing opportunities, closing resource gaps. And then Marty comes in and layers on not only his institutional and working experience with community schools and the organization, but also the takeaways from his recent writings. And then we closed or then moved to the comments from a practitioner steeped in this work already, but bridging both the historical work of her districts and the work they've done in the past to already have community schools and how they want to build on that, given the opportunity that the American Rescue Plan represents. So we have some questions in the chat, but I did want to start with some that I just had for Marty more generally. And that's really something that was hinted at both in your conversation already, Abe, and Dr. Caselias brought up, but I think it bears repetition. How do we convince people to take on this approach and respond to others who might oppose it? And I think this is about as much direct opposition to community schools as it might just be hesitation for what does this mean or what does this look like? So I would leave that up to either of you, but I think I'd prefer to start with Marty.
So, it's a very important issue, and I would encourage people to use two very basic tools: data, stories, and particularly stories that come from families and from students. If any principal, when they look at the data for the school, knows that beyond their test scores, they have attendance issues, they might have behavioral issues, they know that their kids are disengaged from learning, they know there are a host of other questions they need to grapple with. So that to the extent that there is data on chronic absence, data on behavioral issues, data, because many school districts now do surveys on student engagement. All of that can help to make the case that there's a need for other kinds of resources and expertise. Secondly, for me, there is nothing as powerful as the voice of a mother and father speaking about their child. And so in some cases, districts have relationships with community organizations that can access those families. In some cases, you may have one community school where the voices of the people who are there can be used to say, this is what works here. Why can't we do more? This is how my child was assisted and helped. So I think that those two elements are important. And then I would underscore the point that Brenda made, which is that the YMCA is her core partner, because the YMCA brings some expertise that school districts may not have. Educators are different people than youth development people and public health people. And it's the melding or community organizing people, right? Those folks are particularly significant. They were vital in New York to the success of the effort. So understanding, tapping that expertise to have people who might say, gee, I'm not so happy with school, but I love the why. Oh, and the public health center and the community health center is involved. That will give people a way to see this more clearly.
I think I'll just underscore one point there, Noel, which is that, this is a really important time for schools and districts and communities to listen to what's happening with their young people and their families. That even if we thought we knew what was going on before the pandemic, it became pretty clear that there was lots happening that we weren't fully aware of. We should not go back to how things were. We should really look at this as an opportunity to get our ears on and to think differently about what a school can do, not just in this recovery phase, but to redefine what schools are as places that fully engage with partners, with families, with young people, and kind of find new opportunities to work together to meet needs that maybe not everyone was aware of before, but hopefully now we're a little bit clearer about, that there are many things that are not happening that should be happening. And so the hope is that this is why I think we're thinking about this as a moment. Let's not lose the opportunities that are here to more fully engage with partners and with families.
So I had pulled that question from some of the more overarching ones, but we have a pretty in the weeds one that came from Facebook. So I want to pivot completely to that and pose that to you. And so this again comes from our Facebook audience. And I'm not sure if this would be a Marty question or an Abe, but I'm interested in it. Have you obtained any data related to bullying and discriminatory harassment in your schools as compared to other schools? Research has documented that schools that function in an authoritarian manner may have higher rates of bullying. And the person posing the question would suspect that your approach results in reduced rates.
I mean, I don't have any particular data, that granular, but I will say that one of the things we hear from schools that have transformed into community schools is that it's not just that they're doing things differently, it feels different being in a community school. The ways in which people communicate, the ways in which they identify and manage through conflict, the clarity that people have about how we're defining success and how broad that definition becomes when you have more people engaged in it. I think it's sort of difficult to not see those kinds of changes happen when you bring in the kinds of processes that you heard us talking about here today. So even though I can't respond directly to it, I suspect that part of the answer to work against that challenge that this person is identifying is to get more people engaged in the work of schools and to access all the supports and the voices and the ideas that are in the community, but oftentimes they're just are not engaged enough. So that's my response to that.
I would just add that underline more people engaged in the work of schooling, which means that all of us have to be there. It's an interesting notion that schools are authoritarian institutions. Kids go, they're expected to stand in line, they're supposed to do all this. But community schools are democratic institutions where students have voice, where parents have voice, where partners have voice, where educators have voice. So there's a sense of democratic practice, as Ira Harkavy would say, in a community school. And you can see it. And as Abe points out, you can feel it when everyone is there for the young people.
Okay. Lots of questions in the chat. That's what I keep scrolling through. So I want to pivot to some really quick ones, Marty and Abe, that I think you might be able to just drop links in the chat. And as a reminder for everyone who's on this webinar, the recording will be made available to all registrants. We also, in our follow-up email, will include links with all the links that are dropped in the chat. So you don't need to worry about making sure you've got them all, because we'll work here on our end to make sure all resources are sent along to you. Which brings these two questions, which are resource-centric, Marty and Abe. Do you have a CBO or CBOs that you work with? Is that something you can either address quickly in the chat or just spoken word? And do you have a list of indicators that you publish?
Do you want to go, Marty?
So, you know, the initiation of the renewal of the community schools movement was driven by external partners who looked around at public schools and said, we want to help. That is why the Children's Aid Society still lives at IS 218 in Washington Heights. And over the years, we've seen more and more of that kind of work together. The majority of the new community schools that have emerged in the last 20 years have CBO partners who are serving as lead agencies, who hire community school coordinators. YMCAs, universities, health centers, grassroots organizations, community groups of all kinds are playing this role. I have thought that what that does is to send a message to the school and the staff and the community that we want to partner. We're not going to be all in charge of all this. We want a lead partner who gives us credibility and is able to listen and bring into the school more fully the voice of the community.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add on the question around the indicators. There is a great resource the coalition put out many years ago, which there it is, which goes into some depth around the general results categories and also some more specific indicators. These continue to have a lot of great traction with communities all over the country as a really important starting point. Ultimately, communities will oftentimes come up with their own set of results. They'll sort of start here maybe and go deeper in some areas or prioritize certain areas. But I think this is a really good starting point for folks who are trying to understand just, how broadly should we be thinking about results? This is a really important guide.
Just want to add that Abe's point about communities choosing their own results is crucial to this idea of community ownership of the community school. This isn't a top-down model. We need communities to make choices and decisions so they feel like they own the success and they own the challenges, because this is a rocky road toward the success of all the children we want to have.
That's a simple policy truth for a generic policy, let alone something that's more focused. Like, we're going to adopt a policy of approaching through a community school. People buy into what they have a hand in creating, and what they buy into has a higher track record of success and enduring. And that's really going to be paramount to, as frustrating as it might seem, this is a silver lining of COVID-19, is an infusion of federal funding to help support schools in rethinking how they might both address the learning recovery that needs to go on in light of COVID, but also set their districts and systems on a different path so that they can know better and do better, or know differently and do differently post-COVID. I'm very mindful of the time. It's 2:58, and we have superintendents, educators, and community members who have very busy agendas and very big things to do, running school systems and keeping our students safe, healthy, and learning. So I want to take a moment to first thank our participants today, Marty Blank and Abe Fernandez. A deep sincerity to Abe for reaching out with the opportunity to partner on this webinar, and a thank you to all of our participants and people dialing in to take an hour of your day to spend time with us to discuss the important work of community schools and the opportunity to leverage the federal funding available through the American Rescue Plan. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and do look for our follow-up email. Enjoy the rest of your day.